Hello, and welcome to Principles of Microeconomics. This is Module 2.4, and today we will discuss taxation and its impact on the supply and demand model. So to start off with, taxation, and here specifically we will be talking about sales taxes, impose a distortion in the supply and demand model. By imposing a tax on the supply and demand model in the goods and services market, what we observe is that the tax creates a wedge between the price paid by the buyer and the price received by the seller, so that the price paid by the buyer is higher than the equilibrium price, and the price received by the seller is lower than the equilibrium price. Now, what's going to be important to note that it doesn't matter who pays the tax, the buyer or the seller, the tax will be equally levied on both of them. So they will both share the burden of the tax, even if one is paying or the other is paying. So let's explore the impact of taxes on the goods and services market. So when we look at a tax, the tax is going to be the difference between the price paid by the buyer, PB is the price paid by the buyer, price for the buyer, and PS is the price for the seller. So the tax is going to be the difference between these two, PB minus PS. Now, if we are in equilibrium, the price received by the buyers, PE, is the same as the price received by the sellers. The market clears. They both are facing the same prices. When we have a tax, this tax creates a wedge between the prices for buyers and sellers. Now, as you can see, because the price for the seller is lower and the price for the buyer is higher than what they would receive in equilibrium, by the law of supply and demand, this is going to tell us that the quantity that is sold in this market is going to be lower, QT. This area between the tax and the quantity sold is what we call the tax revenue. So to calculate how much revenue the government generates from issuing a tax, we take the size of the tax and we multiply this by the quantity of goods and services sold once we have the tax. So let's work through an example here. Again, you can pause the video, work through this yourself, and then come back for the answers and explanations. So here, let's consider the market for socks, where the equilibrium price, PE, is going to be $5. The equilibrium quantity, QE, is going to be 300. The government imposes a tax of $1 on this market, and it's going to be paid by the seller. But this is going to cause the quantity sold to decrease to 200. Now, we want to draw out the supply and demand model and show what happens before the tax and after the tax. So before the tax, we see that we are at an equilibrium point. Here, at this price, PE, the price for the buyer and the price for the seller are exactly the same. Quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So our market clears. There's no distortions. Now, once the government imposes the tax, you can see that the price for the buyer increases by 50 cents to $5.50, and the price received by the sellers falls to $4.50. So the difference between the price for the buyer and the price for the seller is going to be $1, or the size of the tax. Now here we're assuming that there's an equal sharing of the tax burden. For the buyers, the price rises by 50 cents. For the sellers, the price falls by 50 cents. We see that the quantity falls to 200. So here, the tax revenue, again, is going to be the tax multiplied by the quantity sold. So therefore, the tax revenue is going to be $200. Now, how does this affect market participants? We know that buyers and sellers are both a little bit worse off because the price for buyers rises and the price for sellers falls. But how does that impact them in terms of consumer surplus and producer surplus? Well, let's look at consumer surplus first. Before the tax, the price was $5, the equilibrium price, and it was the same for buyers and sellers. So remember, our consumer surplus is the area above the price and below the demand curve. So here's our area of consumer surplus before the tax. Now, once the tax is imposed, the price for the buyers rises to $5.50, and the quantity falls to 200. So therefore, what we see is that now the new price for the buyer is $5.50, and here's our demand curve. So you can see, comparing these two triangles together, that the consumer surplus decreases with the tax. Consumer surplus after the tax is lower than consumer surplus before the tax. Now, let's look at producer surplus. For producers in equilibrium before the tax, the price was $5. Their producer surplus was the area below the price and above the supply. So here is our producer surplus. Now, once the tax is imposed, the prices that they receive are $4.50. So now their producer surplus is below the new price and above the existing supply curve. So as you can see here, comparing this triangle of producer surplus after the tax with this triangle before the tax, we see that producer surplus also falls with the imposition of the tax. Okay. But there must be some benefits to having a tax, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't have taxes. Well, the benefit comes from the gain in government tax revenue. The government plays an important role in the economy because it provides public goods, goods that the market, if it was left up to its own devices, wouldn't provide, such as public education, national defense, infrastructure such as bridges and roads and highways. So therefore, since the provision of these public goods is important for our economy to function, we do gain something as a society from the government using the tax revenue to pay for these public goods. So in equilibrium, before we have the tax, there's no government revenue because there are no taxes. So in equilibrium, with no taxes, there's no government revenue and no provision of public goods. So now once the tax is imposed, remember the tax revenue is the tax times QT, the amount sold with the tax. So therefore, this rectangle right here will be the size of the government tax revenue. As we mentioned in our last example, it was $200. Now, we have one more area that we're missing, and that's what we call deadweight loss. And deadweight loss is going to be the loss in surplus to society when there's a distortion in the market. And this distortion specifically comes from the fact that we can't reach the equilibrium point. So before the tax, no distortions in the market. We can reach the equilibrium with no problem. The price for buyers and sellers is the same at PE. After the tax is imposed, because there is a tax wedge and the price for the buyers does not equal the price for the sellers, we have a distortion in the market. This triangle here is what we call the deadweight loss, or the loss in surplus that society experiences when the market cannot reach equilibrium. Now, the tax burden is going to depend on the elasticity of the demand curve or the elasticity of the supply curve. If we have equal elasticities in demand and supply, then we're going to have an equal sharing of the tax burden. On the other hand, If the demand curve is relatively inelastic or more inelastic than supply, then the buyer has the bigger tax burden. Here you can see the difference between the price paid by the buyer from the equilibrium price to the price paid by the seller and the equilibrium price. The buyer pays a much greater share of that tax. The same is true for inelastic supply. If the supply is relatively more inelastic than the demand curve, then the supplier pays the bigger part of the tax burden. Here you can see that the difference between the equilibrium price and the price received by sellers is larger than the difference of the price paid by the buyer and the equilibrium price. So here the seller is the one sharing the bigger tax burden. Thank you so much for joining me in Module 2.4 on taxation.